This week on The Wheelhouse. ICE in America and Connecticut. Nationwide protests and questions of free speech. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. The Abraham A. Ribicoff Federal Courthouse is about a 10-minute drive away from where I sit now here in Hartford. It's a place where Federal Immigrations and Customs Enforcement have a local office. And earlier this month, protesters gathered there after an ICE agent killed Renee Good over 1,000 miles away in Minneapolis. Protesters and reporters covering the event were doused with pepper spray. Federal officers also drove through the crowd, and video shows someone appearing to shatter the rear window of a van. We'll play some sound our reporters got from that protest later on in the show. In a statement, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security called the crowd a mob of radical agitators, end quote, and said they were, quote, obstructing federal law enforcement. This hour, we're sorting through the rhetoric and asking how all the players, government agents, protesters, even journalists, are reacting to a new era in American protests. Here to help me with the show, Gloria J. Brown Marshall, an Emmy Award-winning writer and professor of constitutional law. With her newest book, she writes that protest is an American tradition. Gloria, thanks so much for being on the show.
Good morning. Thank you.
And there's the book right next to you. It's A Protest History of the United States. I'm glad that you have that right there on your Zoom screen. Alana Bildner works with the local chapter of the ACLU as a senior staff attorney. Alana, thanks so much for being here. Good to see you in person.
Lovely to see you. Thanks for having me.
Folks, if you have a question, give us a call, 888-720-9677. We're hoping to understand a little bit about your reactions to protests, whether you plan on doing something like that, whether you're against the protests. Give us a call, 888-720-9677. Gloria, we're going to go back a little bit here to May 2020. This was when George Floyd was murdered blocks away from Renee Good's recent fatal shooting. Protests have ignited throughout the country since. Can you give us a sense of how things are evolving or devolving, how protests are sort of changing since then?
Well, there are many similarities as well as differences. The similarities, something happens that really triggers the emotional response in people. They want to do something. They want to show the government that they're angry, that there should be changes made, that something the government did is wrong. And those people go into the streets. They have signs. They're telling the government that they're on the wrong path. That's one thing that's very similar to the murder of George Floyd. And the fact that we saw both of them there, we're looking at the video and the government is saying it's one thing and the people are saying it's something else. And so you have that clash. I think the difference is, even though there was a governmental response to the protests that took place during George Floyd's murder, the government response this time is to be harsher, crueler, actually at federal government against the protesters as opposed to state government that we had before under George Floyd. And the constitutional right to protest was already actually being narrowed, and people are already being used as a target of propaganda because they were exercising their rights. And so now it's an all-out clash without a semblance of attempt to find common ground.
I'm going to bring in Alana here just to get a sense of a basic reaction here from what you're watching as an attorney here. What kind of things are you hoping to see here, or in terms of accountability, what are you hoping to understand, particularly as somebody who has a background, not just in understanding what might happen to an advocate or something like that, but also in handling immigration cases and following them?
I mean, I'm not, it's a great question. And I'm not going to say anything you don't know. We all know kind of intuitively at this point. I like the public and certainly like lawyers around the country are watching with horror, because there's just a total disregard for the law, and that's putting it nicely, right? In many of these interactions, And so, again, not saying anything we don't know, but we're living in very scary times where the normal kind of parameters, the established parameters in the law for how interactions should go between law enforcement and people observing them and reporting on them and making a record of their actions, those parameters are being thrown out the window, in real time as we speak. And we're here fighting, like many, many others, to keep, to hold our ground. That we have constitutional protections, we have state protections here in Connecticut. That is the law, and we'll sit here, stand up, fight for it as long as we have to.
Good to hear your perspective on that. It's very important to hear that, and also to hear your perspective as well, Gloria, as we're talking about sort of what's changing in the last few years. It is ironic to me that this does happen so much as we've seen the videos here of what happened to George Floyd's almost 6 years ago now, and now Renee Good. There's video evidence. We'll ask Alana about that a little bit, but I just want to get your take sort of on how the country sort of in one way being re-traumatized here in a way. Gloria.
Well, unfortunately, protest has always been dangerous. And it may appear as though we freely can exercise our First Amendment rights, the right to peaceably assemble, but we also have the right, which is the last line of the First Amendment, to petition the government for a redress of grievances, to petition to ask for a redress, to fix for grievances, complaints. So we have the right to tell the government our complaints. What we're seeing now and being re-traumatized is that this particular federal government, and because Donald Trump has called himself a dictator, I refer to it as a regime, this particular regime and the masked officers who are perpetrating the oppression of constitutional rights to protest is at a scale way beyond anything we've seen in the past outside of the civil rights movement in the Deep South, when Black Americans were protesting for their right to vote. Then you saw attacks like those in Birmingham, like the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So this is a national wide scale beyond what we saw when the horrendous way in which the local government was attacking protesters, peaceful protesters in the 1960s during that civil rights movement.
Alana, just really quickly here, I want to understand, as we're talking about, there's video here, as we talk about there's a potential re-traumatization of Americans here. Viral video, that's a big part of the story here. Can you help us understand how that might help in terms of accountability and how it might also ignite the situation?
Yeah. And I really want to echo something that Gloria just said, which is so true. It's not that protesters have been, just fine for decades, no problems, not at all. But what we're seeing is orders of magnitude and on a scale just that I think goes beyond anything we've seen so far. Video. I'm glad you raised it. It is. Let me be clear. It is perfectly lawful to record law enforcement activity. Period. Full stop. And filming police, filming law enforcement while they carry out their, daily duties is something that courts have recognized as ubiquitous and lawful for more than a decade now. I would even say decades. The vast majority, or I would say every court of appeals, so that those are the courts right under the Supreme Court to consider the issue, has affirmed that we, citizens and non-citizens, people who are observing police, have the right to record them. That's just part of our First Amendment rights. If we have the right to disseminate speech, we have the right to create speech, and the medium doesn't matter.
First Amendment. That sounds like something that is national and sounds like it's U.S. law. So that's not just necessarily something that varies state by state. Can this be protected throughout America?
Everybody has the right to record the police. Again, I can't say that enough. And in fact, right now, here at the ACLU of Connecticut, we have a case going up to the Second Circuit, our local federal appeals court called Massimino. Again, reaffirming the right to film police. So to be clear, there is no contest. You and I, Frankie, Gloria, everybody in this state, everybody in this country has the right to film law enforcement peaceably in public outdoor spaces, full stop. Of course, they're not acting that.
888-720-9677 is the number to call us. We're going to bring in a caller shortly. Not just yet. I know I'm teasing it, but I just want to ask you one more question about this to sort of button this up. So, as you say, full stop. You can do this. Nonetheless, the federal government is using different rhetoric here, and we'll try to parse through that to do that. But is this something that's just going to have to play out in the courts if particularly they're saying that you can't impede or obstruct law enforcement by taking video? I'd like to get both of your takes on this as well, but we'll start with Alana.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised it, right? So let's go through the nuance here. You can film police. You can police and law enforcement of any kind, ICE and their colleagues. You can't. It is true. You can't obstruct and you can't impede. 18 USC 111 is a federal statute for federal law enforcement. You cannot obstruct them. But the courts have traditionally understood, as any rational person would, that simply standing and filming is not obstruction, is not impeding. Person does not protect incitement, true threats, violence. Right? You can't go beyond. There is a line that you can cross, and I think we all have to be quite careful. And many of us many of us are really at risk in filming police these days. But there's nothing inherently about filming, as any kind of reasonable person I think would agree, that is obstruction or impediment. So filming itself, again, fine. Impeding and obstructing is very much in the eye of the beholder, and that's what makes things dangerous here. Because of course, law enforcement's story might be different from your story when push comes to shove.
I'd like to get your take on it, Gloria. What do you think about that? A First Amendment right, as you're saying, and you're saying this is something that can't be assailed here. This is something that is a part of our history here in the United States. I think assailed is the word. We'll see.
The idea of having witnesses to police brutality goes back a long way. That's how history is recorded. That's how we have the cases that have come over the years. And once again, I go to the civil rights movement. It was because there were people, press at that time, filming the attacks on peaceful protesters, filming the dogs and the water hoses, because there were people at the Edmund Pettus Bridge filming the attacks by sheriff deputies on peaceful protesters, that we have the footage because of what happened with Rodney King, that there was someone to film it. With Walter Scott, there was someone to film it. So film has played a large role in our history of social justice and what we've seen as attack on civilians and attack on peaceful protesters by those people who are whether or not they're civilians or someone else who's participating. That's why we have cameras now, because of what happened with George Floyd. That's what came out of it, that there would be more law enforcement agents with cameras in their vests and in their cars to record this. So it's not just one word against another, because too often when it's law enforcement's word, the juries believe law enforcement, even when they find that sometimes they're not speaking truthfully. So I think the idea of the film is more than just re-traumatization, as we saw with Eric Garner. It's the actual evidence that can be used in court to show how far away someone was, whether or not they were actually impeding any type of action by law enforcement, and who is to blame for the loss of life.
888-720-9677, the number to call if you'd like to join us this morning. We have John from Glastonbury who's giving us a call right now. John, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. Yeah, I figured I'd try to balance the discussion out a little bit. You guys always seem to be so far imbalanced in your reporting.
Oh, thank you so much for that, John. I appreciate it. Go ahead.
Well, I've been following you guys for a very long time and talking with your leadership and so forth. The bottom line is ICE is doing a very, very dangerous job. They're removing some very bad people, and we're not focused on all of the things that they're doing, the bad people that are in our communities as a result of the last administration. We've got child rapists, we've got murderers.
Well, I would like to say that I think that you're focused primarily on trying to make sure that you want to talk about keeping unlawful immigrants out of here. That's what you want to talk about here today.
Right. I mean, we've got over 10 million people estimated, that have come across the border. We had a federal government that was actually suing states from enforcing their borders, removing barriers allowing this influx. That's why we are here today, not to mention the sanctuary cities that basically say we're not going to cooperate with the rule of law. That's not democracy. We're going to harbor these people in our communities. So now ICE has to go out into the communities. So where's the accountability for everything we're facing right now as a result of these very, very bad policies? And we're trying to make them right. And you've got ICE.
John, thank you so much for the call this morning. I appreciate you calling in. John, very not happy with, first of all, our reporting, but also with the Biden administration and a policy of open borders. And he's also talking about sanctuary cities, which is something that we've heard about. We were talking about the rhetoric earlier, which is something that in this protest we were talking about with Hartford earlier. This is something that the Trump administration is using against places like Connecticut, saying that they are harboring folks who are in the country illegally. What do you have to say about John's commentary there? Either of you can respond here.
If you don't mind, one thing that
Go ahead,
we have
Gloria.
to talk about when it comes to protest is that there's always propaganda. And there's propaganda and there's messaging. And so this particular political administration in office right now has been using propaganda again and again and again, actually telling outright lies, fabricating data, talking about, I mean, anybody would be afraid if you're saying there are murderers and rapists running the streets. And so then people start repeating it. Murders, rapists, and then you look at the data and you're saying these people who are being attacked are not murderers and rapists that they're attacking, they're trying to drag out of the country. These are people who are here, maybe undocumented. Some of them that have been picked up by ICE have been U.S. citizens. And then you have ICE covering their faces as though their job is more dangerous than a regular police officer who has a name and a badge and a number that people can recognize as not covering their face. So I think ICE is a part of law enforcement. They're government employees. They should be held to accountability. Their job is going to be to, as been pointed out by this administration, to find undocumented people. The way they're doing it, they have escalated the violence in the communities. And I think the fact that they keep referring so many people, murders, rapists, whatever, it's almost like, they're puppets. And I'm not saying this about John to insult him at all. I'm just saying that when you have a president who's saying this, administration that keeps saying these things again and again, other people are going to repeat them. But when you ask the administration, that's been asked by many people in media, where are the numbers to back up what you're saying? You don't see these numbers, but you've gotten people so afraid now that the country has become even more divided, not just around protests, but the basic reason for the protests in the first place is the action of ICE and the fact that they hide their faces similar to the Ku Klux Klan. And they have all this power of the federal government, and the people have very little power because their federal government is not protecting them. We are being told that ICE is there to protect us, but we don't feel protected. And that's what the government is not hearing. And that's what the protesters are trying to tell the government. You're on the wrong path, that what you're doing is taking violence to another level and instigating even more trouble than it would have been to have undocumented people actually have to go before the courts, which many of them were doing in the first place. And I'm sure Alana can talk more about that.
Powerful testimony there from Gloria as we are about to head to a break. That's why I'm cutting off here and jumping in. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Alana Bildner of EACLU Connecticut and author and constitutional law professor Gloria J. Browne-Marshall are going to stick with us. After the break, more on how journalists are adapting to cover protests amid evolving federal policy. Listen to The Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're talking about modern protests. We're talking about it from the perspective of the protesters, the government, and journalists. Still with me, Alana Bildner of the ACLU Connecticut and author and constitutional law professor Gloria J. Brown Marshall. And joining us now is Elisa Liz Munoz, the executive director of a group that trains newsrooms across America, Connecticut Public included, on how to prepare for and cover protests. Elisa is the executive director of the International Women's Media Foundation. Elisa, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
What stands out to you folks as different with protests in 2026? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. You can also hit us up on our YouTube stream. Gloria, Hartford Mayor Arunan Arulampalam says local police are investigating the incident where federal officials recently drove through a crowd in Hartford. We have that incident following the fatal shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent in Minneapolis. We asked a legal expert what would happen if that sort of scenario unfolded here, and state officials were talking about that. That's actually a separate clip. I'm not going to throw to that one first. I'm going to talk about, I apologize for that. I'm going to talk about a different clip here. Let's get a report that we had from one of our reporters here recently, Danielle Doncel, who covered that protest in Hartford.
Justice for Renee Good. Renee Good.
The courtyard and sidewalk on Main Street were packed with peaceful protesters. Tea light candles lit up the hands of many. Activists who spoke called for unity against ICE and the Trump administration. But halfway through the rally, one of the speakers had to make a sudden announcement.
I'm so sorry. ICE is currently in the back of the building and they're threatening people with pepper spray.
Immigration officials did not respond to a request for comment, but Alex Cuny says he and other protesters were attempting to stop what they thought was a detainee removal by ICE.
5 to 10 people stood here at the exit of the building trying to block the car taking someone. They started pepper spraying people. More people gradually kept trickling in. They kept pepper spraying people. I had water. I'm wearing my bike riding glasses here. I gave water to people, poured it on their face. And then they straight up rammed their car and a big van behind it right through the crowd.
And knocked a person over. A protester broke the window of the van as it drove off.
That is testimony we heard from some of the protesters who were there. Danny Doncel was there as well as cameraman Mark Merko, who was filming some of the action or taking pictures there as well. What do you make of this, Gloria and Alana, particularly after a January 16th order by a U.S. district judge ordered law enforcement to cease actions against peaceful protesters?
There's no accountability. I mean, that's what people are protesting. The lack of accountability, the failure to recognize constitutional rights, the idea that peaceful protesters are being attacked not by other civilians, but by law enforcement themselves. And once again, I talk about the civil rights movement. There seems to be this idea that the civil rights movement and what happened to African Americans in this country is separate from the actions and reactions of protesters going on right now. There's so much to be learned from that time period, so many similarities from what happened then when law enforcement has no accountability. And at this point, when we're talking about self-defense, the issue of violent and nonviolent protests is one in which, in nonviolent protests, people determined by their philosophy, they're not going to respond to violence with violence. But not everybody is trained in nonviolent protests, and not everybody believes in nonviolent protests. So people are acting and reacting based on being attacked by their government.
I think that this is after Renee Good's killing it, people are frustrated and confused, quite honestly. Like, how can law officers act with impunity in viral videos on a national stage? Frankly, this has been going on now for, as Gloria points out, this is nothing new. But once again, we are asking the question of where is the accountability? And I think that the protesters in Hartford were rightly enraged by the fact that it seems like federal law enforcement can kill people and go on their merry way. And I understand that rage very much. I will say again, there is the law, there's the rule of law, and that is what we're all trying in these protests to fight for, to vindicate, to uphold, to make a reality in this country. And then there's the law of the street. So I think it is important, and I want to say this out loud. for people to kind of figure out what kinds of risks they are comfortable with when protesting, and how they can, stay calm, make sure that they really stay clear of the line of obstruction or interference, in a way that will to make them feel comfortable, right? You cannot touch, push, hit officers. That's going to be that's going to be hard to defend. But again, you can peaceably protest, and that's that. We can't be afraid to protest, because that is the act of protest.
The distinction.
That's out there.
Alana, thank you so much for that, because the distinction is important there. As a journalist, I must point out that, first of all, we hear what the federal government is saying about this. They're characterizing this as a mob of agitators, radical agitators. So there's the rhetoric there. But I'm also going to say that at some point in the incident, we don't know. I don't know exactly when. Somebody else does, but there was perhaps this van that was broken into, this window or whatever. So I just want to bring that up, just in case somebody can try to say that this isn't exactly a peaceful protest, whatever in that regard. But nonetheless, you have the fatal shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent in Minneapolis. We asked the legal expert what would happen if that sort of scenario unfolded here, and state officials felt compelled to investigate. Here's former state lawmaker Mike Lawler, acting associate dean of Lee College at the University of New Haven.
Every state is sovereign in its own right, and so a state can choose to pursue an investigation and potentially an arrest, and the feds can do the same thing. Now, what the feds can do is make it difficult for the state to pursue an investigation, but they can't prevent it.
So they can't prevent it. Either of you can unpack that there, Alana or Gloria, if you want to, but this came up in Indianapolis, or excuse me, in Minneapolis, where the state government was talking about an investigation, and federal government probably didn't want interference there, from what it sounds like from the rhetoric. What do you say, Alana?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, there has been an erosion of doctrine in the law to hold federal officers, federal employees accountable for civil rights violations and other violations. And we've seen that over the past, 60, 70 years now, where Supreme Court after Supreme Court has kind of narrowed the pathways to holding federal law enforcement accountable. That's reality. That's reality. On the other hand, Mike Lawler's right. Like, there's law. The Minnesota authorities are trying quite hard to figure out there are ways to prosecute federal law enforcement, and they're trying to under state law, under state criminal law, and they're trying to figure out, and they're trying to investigate. And it sounds like, again, by all the news accounts, they're being impeded in doing so. Again, erosion of the rule of law, something that we should all in a democracy be really concerned about. Why would federal authorities be stopping a state from trying to uphold its own criminal laws? Again, that's why we're protesting. That's why we need to be protesting, right? And to John, who called in earlier, I would say John and I probably agree. We disagree about a lot, that's for sure, but we probably agree that this is a democracy, and we want to have the rights under our Constitution, right? We want our Fourth Amendment rights not to be searched and seized. We want our First Amendment rights to be able to protest and to speak out, and to video protests, among other things, to be upheld. ICE is not listening to that. It is not listening to the law. I cannot be clearer. All of these interactions are really outside the law in a way that should concern anybody on any side of the political spectrum, right? This is our Constitution. This is real.
Gloria, just really quickly here, if you can, for us, why might states want to investigate this? And what are you understanding in terms of how long it might take for all of this to play out? If there's a state investigation, there's a federal investigation, and then maybe the courts have to intervene.
Well, it's going to be very difficult, because this federal government has decided that it is going to use propaganda. It's going to violate the law. It's going to ignore the Constitution. So if that's happening at the top, and the ICE agents are working for that government, they are not going to respect the law. They're not going to respect protesters or constitutional rights. And so in order to maintain this regime and its police officers with masks on that are ICE agents, and we don't even know where they're coming from, who they are, what qualifications it took for them to become these agents, and the fact that they're acting with impunity. They are, the federal government, impeding the state from having its own investigations. And the state is seen as the enemy. And so the federal government is not going to allow the state to have the full investigations that are needed to hold the ICE agents accountable, because the ICE agents are doing what the federal government wants it to do, which is to terrorize people, terrorize communities, and make protesters feel it's so dangerous they're not going to exercise their right to free speech and assembly and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And the power of the people is attempted to be undermined, but the people will continue to speak out because, as Alana said, they're upset, angry, and they're looking for the Constitution to be upheld when it's being ignored. And that's the clash that's happening right now. This is an issue dealing with a constitutional crisis in our democracy.
The NFL championships, the conference championships are this weekend. So here's a football metaphor for you. Elisa, get ready for the ball to come your way a lot here in the next few questions here. As protests are continuing around the United States, how have media organizations tried to protect their journalists? We just talked about here a situation where folks that we know here in Hartford were doused with pepper spray. What can you offer here in the interim?
I think the truth is that journalists are under the same threats as the general public when it comes to these demonstrations, and that should not be the case. I am not suggesting that the general public should be under any kind of threat, but certainly there are particular protections for journalists under press freedom. They should be able to document what is going on the ground without being threatened, harassed, or targeted. So media organizations are having to adapt in real time to a crisis situation that is putting their journalists in real harm, physical harm. And they are responding by calling organizations like the IWMF to provide security training, to provide PPE, protective gear, to provide gas masks, and to teach journalists how to put them on, and to generally give journalists legal advice about how to comport themselves and what their rights are on the ground, who they need to call if they are detained. It's a very, very dangerous situation for journalists. And I must add that it is important to consider who these journalists are who are covering these ICE raids as well and these protests, because it matters what you look like, it matters who you are, and those kinds of considerations are also being considered in news organizations around the country.
We talked about the threshold here for the general public. Obviously, the journalists are held to a different standard here, or at least should be, to federal law here. So help us understand what the threshold might be for journalists in terms of any advice that you could give them to sort of do their job and maybe not get in trouble while out on the field. Go ahead.
Well, the advice that we've given journalists has actually had to be adapted and changed throughout this situation. So, for example, where we normally would tell journalists, you don't need to carry your passport, we're now telling journalists, carry your passport. Where we would tell maybe a journalist who's here under other kinds of visas, et cetera, we're telling them, carry your documentation and show your documentation. So that's one change. But the other change is, for example, don't go wearing full tactical gear, because that is signaling that your intentions are bad instead of protective measures. We are also giving journalists tactical advice in terms of how to interact in this crowd, how much time to spend in the heart of the conflict as opposed to on the back end of the conflict, working with your fellow journalists, which I know is not necessarily coming natural to most journalists who are competitors, but it's important to have a buddy system, talking to their editors about where they are, how long they should stay there, when they should decide to leave the scene. It's increasingly difficult for them to document what is going on the ground and to perform the role that they uphold in our communities, which is to hold the powerful to account.
One of the things that struck me in the training that I received is that what journalists may face out in the field, what the general public may face out in the field, in our training came across as rubber bullets all the way up to the bullet that may be found or used in an AR-15. And you're sort of having to go around the country and tell journalists that this is a real threat that's out there. So one of the things that can protect you is tactical gear. I've seen some of the vests that you have been able to tell people about, but obviously many of them may not be able to protect you from an AR-style rifle. Nonetheless, the guidance is ever evolving here. You're saying that folks may not necessarily focus on the tactical gear because it may give off a different sort of vibe to these federal law enforcement that are out there and sort of enforcing the law at this point.
Indeed. The advice that we're giving journalists today is similar to the advice that we were giving journalists around the world covering war zones. And unfortunately, those situations are ever changing, and journalists know their communities and know the situation on the ground. We take note and speak at length before we conduct one of these trainings. You may have been interviewed before you participated in the training to really find out what's going on the ground. And it is a fine line that journalists are having to walk in terms of their role within these protests as observers, when they may be perceived as participants or are willingly treated as participants. We received an email from a journalist observing and documenting the protests in Minneapolis, and he told us that he was tear gassed 3 times in one morning. So that is the kind of situation that journalists are facing, making it obviously extremely difficult and dangerous to perform their duties to our communities.
I want to also talk about the digital footprint that we may leave behind. This is something that you also talk about. I myself have updated several passwords, things like that, after the training and learning about my digital footprint. Why is this important for reporters, even protesters? Your phone and what you do with your phone when you're out at a protest. Can you just help us understand why this might be important for folks?
Absolutely. And this is one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the country in the past year is the increased use of surveillance technology during these protests. It really makes your hair stand on end when you hear about this facial recognition that is giving police and law enforcement real-time connection into an individual's social media activities, into where they live, license plate readers. So journalists are really up against extremely advanced technology, and it's very hard to keep up with the technology that is being used against them. You can be in a demonstration area and have your phone tracked, your location tracked, your identity known, your home address found. And so part of the training that we are giving journalists are ways to mitigate the damage that having that kind of information in the public eye can lead to in terms of being targeted and being followed and being pursued by law enforcement.
One last question I want to throw to you here. I apologize for giving you the ball so much here. Hopefully you're having a sip of water or something like that, as I am here.
I appreciate the questions.
Nonetheless, but you got to help us out with one more thing here. Considerations before and after the protests, local, state, and federal investigation of protests, and now federal investigations of journalists. What do you make, Elisa, of the FBI search of a Washington Post reporter's home? And what Poynter says is, quote, rare and part of a growing problem, unquote.
This is a ratcheting up of the stakes. It's a watershed moment for journalists to have their homes searched for information about their sources. There are a lot of legal experts contemplating what this means for press freedom and for individual journalists. It's my understanding that this Washington Post reporter was not the target of the investigation, and nevertheless, her home was raided and her devices were seized. It's an escalation. It's extremely worrying, and it's one more threat that journalists are facing. This journalist was lucky. She is working for the Washington Post that has legal resources and ample protections for her, but there are many journalists working out there on their own for small news organizations, and they need equal support and opportunity to protect their journalists and themselves as organizations.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're out of time for these first two segments. We had a terrific conversation. I wish I could speak to the three of you all day. Tremendous conversation. Gloria J. Brown Marshall, Emmy Award-winning author and professor of constitutional law at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. There's that book right next to her, A Protest History of the United States. Look for that on the web. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Gloria.
Thank you.
Alana Bildner, a staff attorney with ACLU Connecticut. Alana, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll keep in touch with you as well, Alana. And Elisa Liz Munoz, the executive director of the International Women's Media Foundation. Elisa, thank you once again for your help.
Thank you.
After the break, we're going to talk to three student journalists, or excuse me, two of them, about what they're seeing at protests on a local college campus. Questions for them or me, even a reaction, give us a call, 888-720-9677. It's the Wheelhouse on Connecticut Public. If you want to talk to us, you got to call us now. More Wheelhouse after this.
Got nurses headed home, and the jails of Maricopa say a man is but his wrong. It's morning in America, but I can't see the dawn. Congressman in Washington.
This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. Talked all hour about changing views of protests in America in 2026. And now we're going to try to get some reaction from student journalists. Miles Pinsoff Berlowitz continues the incredibly important work of student journalists making our young people heard. Miles is an outgoing co-editor-in-chief of the Wesleyan Argus. Miles, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Frankie.
Thomas Lyons joins Miles as a fall editor-in-chief of the Argus. Thomas seeks to make student voices heard worldwide. Thomas, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Folks, if you're wanting to call in, give us a call right now, 888-720-9677. We'll try to get a call in. Might be more of a comment at this point as we're about 5 minutes to the end of air or something like that. Thomas, you are one of the fall editors-in-chief here. Before I get sort of the idea of what's happening on campus and if there's any kind of reaction to what's happening sort of nationally here, can you both unpack what you just heard and if there was anything that was rather helpful to your reporting or at least something that you want to comment on that is going similar for you? Were you able to hear the segment, Thomas?
I was not. I was in the waiting room.
What about you, Miles? Were you able to hear it?
Yeah, I was. And I think it's really interesting hearing about the precautions that journalists are having to take in cities like Minneapolis, possibly Chicago, which is actually my hometown. And I'm feeling both grateful that at Wesleyan in Middletown, we haven't had to take the same extreme precautions. Certainly some of the things like digital surveillance are on our mind. But considering, the bulletproof vests that journalists are wearing in Minneapolis, the gas masks, things like that, I'm grateful for that. And it's really interesting to hear the challenges that journalists are facing and the bravery of them in bigger cities.
Thomas, are you seeing any kind of reaction to what's happening nationally on campus? Is there any kind of student protest or any concern being raised from student organizations?
Certainly. I mean, our spring term is just now starting. And so I'm driving back to campus today.
Sure.
But certainly in the fall, we saw a lot of protest activity against ICE, against these increasing deportations. And so certainly Wesleyan students are very vocal and tuned into the national scene, both online and then in person.
Can you give us an example of how this might play out? I think about the University of Connecticut because that's where I went to. Sometimes you see a lot of people that gather. If you're really unfamiliar with Storrs, there's Gamble Pavilion, and then there's sort of a courtyard there that people may gather. Can you help paint a picture of where people might be at Wesleyan? Or is this something that might happen online? Where might somebody gather if they really care about an issue in Middletown at Wesleyan?
Sure. Oftentimes people are organizing in front of the USDAN University Center, which is a very central focal point on campus, or directly outside President Michael Roth's office on College Row. I think last year students staged sit-ins in President Roth's office. And so when people are in person, it is oftentimes in those central areas. Last spring, of course, there was an encampment right around the USDAN University Center. And so people are in person often on campus.
Policies may be evolving or changing as some of these things happen. I know that at least at the University of Connecticut, I was saying there was folks that were commenting on what was happening between Israel and Gaza. The conflict there, and there were protests, but some of the students were concerned about if they were an international student, like a visa or something like that. Are you having to adopt any of your any changes to some of your standards at the paper, at the Argus? Is there anything that you're having to do to sort of maybe protect the identity of students or something like that? Your sources.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we have had to extend our anonymity protections to many international students this fall. We helped to standardize our anonymity policy, and both for sources and then also for reporters. Our staff has a lot of really incredible, determined international students on our masthead, and sometimes if, say, they are covering I don't know, something about the Israel-Gaza or something related to the Trump administration, an international student might report on that issue and then give that byline to maybe a co-writer or another U.S. citizen on the masthead. And so in that way, we're both extending our anonymity for sources and then also for reporters themselves.
Miles, your thoughts quickly on having to change this, or at least the conversations that you, Thomas, are having, and some of the other folks that are sort of on the masthead with you all managing the paper.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly been a balance. We want our readership to always know who our sources are, particularly if they're central to a story. We want them to know if we're granting them anonymity, why we're doing that, what their role is loosely. I think that's crucial. And we've been able to maintain that while also extending anonymity to people who are afraid of, being targeted by the federal government, being fired from their job, anything along those lines, the types of attacks and targeting that we've seen in the last year of the Trump administration.
Is everything okay with international students on campus? You talked about having to change maybe a byline if it's necessary, or at least having to maybe give it to somebody else. You're talking about the policies. How generally are international students faring on campus at this time?
I would say it's a complex question. I don't want to answer for international students as I'm not one. But to me, it seems that the federal government is targeting international students unfairly and potentially illegally. They are essentially wielding unlimited power to revoke student visas. of international students. And if I were an international student, I would be very worried about speaking out politically against the federal government. They have very little protections to stop their student visas from being revoked. And if that happens, they can potentially fight it in court, but it is an individualized, expensive battle. And it's one that a lot of international students do not want to delve into.
One last question as we finish up here, Thomas. You got some incoming editors-in-chief coming in here. What's your advice for folks here as we move on to 2026 here and covering the news at Wesleyan in about 20 or 30 seconds, if you can give us that?
Sure. I mean, I think as much as we're in a scary political moment, the newsroom for me has always been a place of joy and discovery. And so as much as we can share important political stories and highlight the joy of Wesleyan students and all the amazing things they're doing, that balance feels really crucial.
Really cool to hear from Thomas and Miles. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thomas Lyons, outgoing co-editor-chief from the Wesleyan Argus, as well as Miles Pinsoff-Berlowitz. Today's show, produced by Tale Ricketson. It was edited by Patrick Scahill. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Tess Terrible was on the phone. Thank you so much for all the work that you did here today, Tess. Megan Fitzgerald, a special happy birthday to her as well. Connecticut Public's visuals team and our operations staff. Megan Boone as well for all of her work. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.